Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the welcome. And I was thrilled to receive an invitation to speak because the way we eat does impact our planet. And we're facing a climate emergency, and I don't think I need to convince anyone of that. Witnessing deforestation, and we are experiencing a loss and indeed a collapse of some ecosystems and a loss of biodiversity. In fact, this week an article was published in the journal Nature, probably one of the premier journals in the area, that suggests that we may have already passed some of the tipping points in our planetary systems, and that's far earlier than was initially predicted. Tensions are running high, voices are becoming louder, and people are taking to the streets, and we are being told that life as we know it in the industrialised world probably can't continue the way we've all known it. Greta Thunberg has spoken about some bad ideas, seeking endless economic growth on a fixed resource pool, and the endless consumption that got us into the mess isn't going to get us out of it. More and more voices are telling us that we must also address our diet as well as the general way we consume. And tonight I wanted to, if you'll forgive the pun, set the table for the discussion around the impacts of our diet on the environment. I want to talk about the history of how Australians come to eat the way they do, and I'll give you a snapshot of what the diet of our first peoples might have looked like. I'll talk about some of the defining characteristics of the Australian diet, and indeed just what we do eat for dinner each night. I then wanted to share with you some of the research that I did, where I quantified the greenhouse gas emissions attached to eating dinner in Australia in the 21st century. I call this our foodprint. This was the result of research I carried out a couple of years ago as part of my master's degree, and I've updated that recently with some other content from some other authors who have published similar work. I'll outline the drivers for the CO2 emissions and suggest some opportunities for the food and agriculture industry in which I've worked, also for government and the community, and key for us as individuals. What can we do to help address the looming issues of climate change through our diet? But first I need to declare some interests, and firstly I take my food very seriously. It's certainly kept me employed and given me and my wife, who's a local chef in Orange, much pleasure, and food should give us pleasure. As a food technologist, I've worked in the food and beverage industry for the last 25 years or so, and I have myself been responsible for many product launches and involved with many product brands that you'd be familiar with on the supermarket shelf. Chicken Tonight, Rosella, Lipton's, Bushell's, Orchie and Nudie fruit juice, a few wine brands, and probably one that's very close to the heart of anyone who lives here in Bathurst, the Chico Roll. For many years now I've read the likes of Michael Pollan, Raj Patel, Eric Schlosser, Wendell Berry, Marion Nestle, Jane Digasso and Joanna Blythman, all of whom have written on the social, political, health and environmental implications of our modern food system. But I'm increasingly challenged by the environmental aspect of our food system here in Australia, and one that I've been a part of for 25 years or so. So let's move to the aperitifs for the night. As a starting point, I think we can all agree that good planets are hard to come by. And quoting from the 2018 CSIRO State of the Climate report, concentrations of all the major long-lived greenhouse gases in the atmosphere continue to increase, with carbon dioxide concentrations rising above 400 parts per million since 2016, and the equivalent of all gases, so that includes methane and nitrous oxides and the like, are above 500 parts per million for the first time in 800,000 years. You've got a handout there which I've put some key points and shared some data on, so you're welcome to follow that along. And it's also something for you to take away and to help you think about just what the impact of our diet is. Emissions from fossil fuels continue to increase, and the main contributors are the main contributors to that observed growth in atmospheric CO2. Australia's climate has warmed already by just over 1 degree since 1910, leading to an increase in the frequency of extreme heat events. Globally, it has also gone up by a bit over 1 degree since records began in 1850, and each of the last 4 decades has been warmer than the previous one. The IPCC report talks about a watershed of 1.5 degrees beyond which irreversible climate change will occur, and we're spending that remaining budget pretty rapidly. Oceans around Australia have warmed by a degree since 1910, contributing to longer and more frequent marine heat waves. Sea levels are rising, increasing the risk of inundation. Global sea level has risen by over 20 centimetres since 1880. The oceans around Australia are acidifying with pH decreasing, and the world's oceans, especially in the southern hemisphere, are taking up more than 90% of the extra energy stored by the planet as a result of the greenhouse gas emissions. The results of that acidification, of course, we know as coral bleaching. April to October rainfall has decreased in the southwest of Australia, and across the same region, May to July rainfall has also seen the largest decrease by around 20% since 1970. And as we are all acutely aware in Australia, particularly over the last couple of months, there's been a long-term increase in extreme fire weather and in the length of the fire season across large parts of Australia. We are living in the age where, for the first time, human behaviour is now driving the climate. Let's move to the appetisers for the night. Australia's relationship with food and the history of our cuisine is quite different to that of most other nations of the world. As a fully developed first world economy, we went from, some would say, a hunter-gatherer land, but I would prefer to say a form of organised agriculture, as Bruce Pascoe has suggested. And we've gone from that to a highly industrialised agricultural food system in the space of 200 years. In the last 75 years or so, our food system has become unrecognisable to what our grandparents would have grown up with. We completely bypassed the agrarian age. Most other nations developed their local agricultural food systems over the last 10,000 years, experimenting with different crops, agricultural methods, and cultural settings, importantly. And they were all suited to the local conditions and environment, and they yielded achievable economic and social outcomes for the community and the landholders. Australia was really quite different in its growth of our food system. Our act of eating is a very powerful engagement with nature, and an act that impacted nature, and probably more so now than ever before. The IPC has said that we have no chance of saving the planet unless we eat differently. When we sit down to our meals 3 times a day and think about all the snack times in between, do we think about those impacts? We need to start eating dinner as if the world depended on it. Let's just go back to prior to white settlement, a little over 200 years ago. Evidence suggests that our first peoples lived a healthy and contented life, largely in ecological balance with the land. Our First Nations people have one of the oldest living cuisines based on food systems older than modern agriculture itself. The food supplies of the nations depended on locality and season. The peoples hunted large marsupials and emus, while those peoples living in more coastal areas caught dugong, turtles, river and estuarine fish, crabs, oysters, mussels, and other shellfish. Sounds actually really quite great. Women and children would gather native nuts, vegetables and fruits, including wild plum, berries, figs, macadamias and bush tomatoes. And our original inhabitants scarcely disturbed the prehistoric environment in search of nourishment. And their food supplies were ensured by not over-harvesting, not taking undersized animals, and managing their own population growth and moving on when food became scarce. In contrast, when the first fleet arrived, they brought with them enough food supplies to last 200 years, along with the distillation of thousands of years of slowly gathered experience in securing, preparing and consuming foods. They clearly didn't have faith in the land they were coming to that it could provide for them. The food cultures and expectations of food of the pioneer were a snapshot of Britain at that time. It seems odd to me that we could expect to take a set of methods from one part of the world and transport them without hiccup and have success in a new country. The new settlers had years of struggle ahead of them as they grappled with new seasonal patterns, a very different climate, poor soils in many cases, and rainfall largely unsuited to their European-based food expectations and farming history. Food was rationed in the fledgling economy almost from the start, and rations were successively cut, almost to starvation levels. These early years became known for very good reason as the hungry years, as the diet was nutritionally imbalanced, with convicts too malnourished to be able to do a full day's work. The colony survived through this time not by its own success, but from sources supplemented from abroad, which were often late if they arrived at all. And what's more is they were so heavily preserved by salt, they were often too spoiled for only but the desperately hungry. Compare that with what our first people were eating, and I know which one I'd prefer. European-style farming was the only solution in the settlers' eyes, and they largely ignored the indigenous options. The settlers imposed a method of farming on the land that was completely unsuitable. Captain Phillip was himself a farmer from southern England, and he recognised that the rocky soils around Sydney Cove were probably unsuitable to agriculture, and so went in search of more fertile lands in order to set up the food supplies for the colony. And it was not until 1795 that produce from home and market gardens and orchards contributed significantly to the volume of food required for the nation. And it wasn't until the end of that century when the wheat harvest was sufficient to provide for all the needs of the colony, with some to spare. The start of our love affair with meat began around the 1820s, when there was finally enough fresh meat to replace the salted imports. Crossing the Blue Mountains in 1813 opened up the vast interior, and so began our cultural identity and our pastoral industries. And they became a mainstay of our economy, even to this day. Meat became widely available for the first time and relatively cheap, and was frequently consumed 3 times a day. This relative food affluence no doubt helped to improve the health of the young nation, and records of that time actually indicate for the first time that children born here in Australia versus their counterparts in the UK actually ended up 5 centimetres taller. But this high meat consumption, or rather a criticism of the high meat consumption, isn't a modern phenomenon. It was first criticised back in 1841 by Dr. Peter Cunningham, who had been a medical superintendent of convicts on the voyages from England. He contended that a diet based so heavily on meat was completely incompatible with Australia, and believed that a Mediterranean way of eating based on bread, fruits, vegetables, and only relatively small amounts of meat was far more suitable. Dr. Philip Muscat, writing later in the 19th century, agreed with Cunningham's arguments, adding that our climate should dictate a diet closer to that of Mediterranean countries. These are not new ideas. We became a nation of carnivores, with meat still very prevalent today and still growing. And if you look at figure 1 in your handout, Australians consume around 90 kilograms of meat a year. So that's about 250 grams a day. Okay, be it chicken, beef, pork, or lamb. Overall, Australians now consume around 3.1 kilos of foods and beverages a day. And yet 2/3 of us are overweight or obese. And that's more than 11 million of us. On a range of indicators, the Australian population are certainly food secure, consuming more than they require, as shown by the shift in what we call the body mass index, the BMI, and that's shown in figure 2 there, where you see the curve is shifted to the right. It is worth just noting that as a population we might be food secure, but certainly we're all aware of individuals who are not food secure. But as a population we have more than enough food to feed ourselves. Eating habits are really the last cultural vestige to be dropped or modified when people migrate to another land, and the way of eating in the colony was very British, and their food prejudices probably worked against any idea of experimentation with the local cuisine. However, in the early Australian cookbooks of the 1800s, there are recipes for kangaroo, but today the uptake of Indigenous foods is very low, say for fish and I think the macadamia nut. Over white settlement, our diet has become very meat-centric and our calorific intake has been growing along with our girth. We are aware of some health problems of chronic disease, but it's not doing the planet any good either. So there's a lot of literature out there, and briefly, that literature has documented the benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions on plant-based diets over animal protein-based diets, of the relative benefits of eating chicken and pork and fish over the meat of ruminant animals, of eating a Mediterranean diet over a typical Western diet, and of eating less processed and more natural foods, and also of reducing our overconsumption and also reducing our food waste. I'll come to those points a little later. The literature has also espoused the benefits of eating organically produced foods over conventionally processed foods. All of these food behaviours would result in a reduced level of dietary greenhouse gas emissions. The literature also supports the broad idea that following the healthy eating guidelines, that populations can achieve positive outcomes both for individual health and positive environmental outcomes, with probably one major exception, and that is fish, where the National Healthy Eating Guidelines call for us to eat fish. But if you'll forgive me for the cliche, there simply are not enough fish in the sea. While the literature is exhaustive on the impacts of what I call model diets on dietary greenhouse gas emissions, the literature out there is largely silent on any research about the greenhouse gas emission impacts of actual meals that people eat in a cultural setting. We don't eat foods in isolation, we eat them as part of meals in that cultural settings. And in my studies, I considered what Australians actually eat each night and look at the greenhouse gas emissions of those meals. Where do our meals fit in our national ecological budget? And the originality of my work was in that attempt to understand the greenhouse gas emissions of typical meals prepared and consumed each night around dinner tables, and to understand what the drivers were for those emissions. So we come to the main course. So there is on that handout what Australians are sitting down to dinner each night. And this was from research in 2009 and 2011 by the Meat and Livestock Association, who commissioned research to provide an in-depth understanding of Australians' main meal practices, focusing on meals prepared at home. 9 out of 10 Australians still cook at home each night, and consistent with our heritage, 90% of the meals we eat are based on beef, chicken, lamb or fish. 92% of the meals eaten do contain vegetables. Some dishes are more likely to be eaten on certain nights of the week, and we can probably think about our own experiences, particularly growing up: roast lamb on Sundays, spaghetti bolognese or stir fry during the week. Now think about your own dietary or your own meals during the week. How do they compare to those? But number one is still steak and 3 veg. Roast chicken and vegetables, spaghetti bolognese, a beef casserole or stew, chicken stir fry, pan-fried chicken and vegetables, lamb chops or cutlets and vegetables, pan-fried or grilled fish and vegetables, and a chicken casserole and lamb roast. I think with the current price of lamb, that may well drop out of the top 10. Convenience, taste and health are the main motivating factors for those choices. But neither cost or environmental concerns were a reason for the meal choices, which would tell you about the relative importance in people's decision making. I think it'd be interesting if we did the same study today, if there would be any change. So the IPCC reports that 12% of global emissions are attributed to agriculture, and this figure rises to 20% when additional emissions from fuel use, fertiliser and agriculturally induced land clearing are included. In Australia, our own national greenhouse gas inventory reports that agricultural emissions, principally from methane from ruminant livestock and nitrous oxides from fertilisers, are responsible for around about 16% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and I've shown that in figures 3 and 4 there. Food, beverage and tobacco manufacturing represent a further 1% of those emissions. In my literature review for my thesis, there was no study that quantified the greenhouse gas emissions arising from the entire global food chain. However, there are studies that come out of Europe that show that food accounts for 31% of the greenhouse gas emissions in that jurisdiction. So for the sake of argument, let's work on a figure of around about 30%. Let's call it a quarter to a third of all of our emissions are a result of the food we eat. And the food we eat has been described as the single most environmentally destructive thing that we as individuals do. So given rising global incomes and the fact that as people become wealthier, they tend to adopt a more Western diet, a diet high in meat and processed foods, our foodprint, if you like, that is the greenhouse gas emissions coming from our diet, is going to be a significant issue for the planet. Many authors in my reading suggest that if we are to achieve that reduction, we have to come back to that point about how we eat. While 2/3 of Australians have concerns about the environment, there is very little understanding that the food choices we make contributes to those emissions. And moving to a sustainable diet will also improve the health outcomes for our population. So to me, a few things came together in my research: that rising global population and rising incomes, a static if not decreasing resource pool, in Australia a diet based heavily on meat even still, and a poor understanding at the consumer level of the environmental effects of the food choices that we make. Obviously, we all have to eat. It's not like if there were no petrol, we just wouldn't drive. We still have to eat. But just like transportation, we must confront the reality that we might have to change the way we eat. It is clear to me that as food and agriculture are such a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, then we as individuals now have to do something to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So in my research, I took those 10 most common meals that are served at dinner each night, and I sought out some representative recipes for those meals. I went to sources like Women's Weekly, taste.com.au, and the SBS. For each of those 10 meals and each of those recipes for those meals, using publicly available data, I calculated the greenhouse gas emissions of those meals as those recipes would have us prepare them. And while averages can be dangerous statistics, the average dinner serve is responsible for about 3.7 kilos of greenhouse gas emissions. You probably think, but how much is that? So now for our audience participation. Oh, I can't throw very well.
Thank you. Oh, I thought you were going to get two of them.
Swap colours if they don't suit you.
Oh, look, there's a blue one on the floor. Look, you've got to have blue.
And yellow in the bag. So I'm going to get you to blow that up in a minute. But just before we do, so while CO2 in the atmosphere, as you heard, is around about 400 parts per million, your breath is about 5% or 50,000 parts per million CO2. So 100 times more concentrated. But if for a moment you could imagine that all the air you put into the balloon was CO2, how many balloons would you need to create that 3.7 kilos? So I'd like you to blow that balloon up. And imagine you inflate it. We're looking for about a balloon 30 centimetres. I'll blow one for you.
lot more than this.
So I couldn't get bigger balloons, but they're probably not quite 30 centimetres, but let's just imagine for a minute they are. So a few back of the envelope calculations equates that 3.7 kilos, okay, to around about 134 of those balloons. But as your breath is 100 times more concentrated, that's going to be about 13,400 balloons.
Oh, that wasn't enough.
Okay. But what does that mean? Think about how far you drive your car. That's the equivalent to getting in your car and driving 20 kilometres and going nowhere.
So you can say 13,000 of these.
At atmospheric concentration, because your breath is 100 times more concentrated than the atmosphere.
So that would be 3.5 kilos
Of CO2. So I chose to focus on dinner as it is generally the meal that most people value the most. It's the biggest meal of the day usually, and the one where people tend to gather together in family units, and the one where our celebrations and rituals take place. And my work used a comparison benchmark of about 40% of the daily kilojoule intake comes from dinner. In all likelihood, more than 40% of the emissions would come from dinner for a whole host of reasons. But as you saw earlier, meat features heavily in the meal choices of Australians, which is why I suggest that more than 40% of the emissions will come from it. So what are the drivers in our meals for those greenhouse gas emissions? The Nutrition and Physical Activity Survey from 2014 estimated that Australians consume around about 8,500 kilojoules a day. However, such nutrition surveys are known for significant underreporting. Adjusting for that underreporting, a more accurate representation might be around about 11,500 kilojoules. Well in excess of what we need, mind you. On top of that, Australians waste around 20% of the food, of the food that we serve ourselves. So for an Australian, that's around a total food intake at dinner of around about 13,900 kilojoules. I have pretty good confidence in that number because the other way you can look at it is how much food does Australia produce as a whole? And based on FAO data, I can bring that back to around about 13,500 kilojoules. So I'm confident in that number. This analysis of the food supply has demonstrated again that Australians, we overconsume. And save for athletes and people who are in rapid growth, we don't need anywhere near that number of kilojoules each day. This overconsumption itself represents an opportunity for society to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, as well as achieve positive health outcomes. I want to preface the next part of the presentation tonight by saying that it's wrong to demonise particular foods. And I've spoken a little bit about meat, but it is wrong to do that. There's a great deal written, often in highly emotive language, about meat and its impact on the environment. I've even heard meat described as the petrochemical of the food system. Now, I want to steer clear of that, okay? I don't think it's helpful for the discussion. And we should not approach this in a binary way, where animal food is bad and plant food is good. Food is so rooted in our cultures that if we demonise foods, we run the risk of demonising those very cultures. And I think that would be very counterproductive. So my work shows that based on the greenhouse gas emissions, that certainly recipes of fish and chicken consumed in a modern Australian context have far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than beef and lamb meals, and that correlates with other researchers. My work, though, does not attempt to quantify the benefits to the environment or health if Australians were encouraged to switch out from one type of meal to another based on a lower greenhouse gas emission. Such a quantification recommendation would have quite perverse outcomes. For example, ceasing beef production in Australia might achieve a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but would then render large parts of the country unused, as alternative farming enterprises may not be suitable to those rangelands due to topography or rainfall. In addition, beef meat makes a valuable nutritional contribution with its protein and iron content, and effectively converts for humans an unavailable foodstuff, grass, to an available and nutrient-dense foodstuff. At a global level, in countries in Asia and Africa, many small landholders make an existence from raising a few head of cattle. Are we to deny them the right to do so? The Macquarie Dictionary defines the word recipe as any formula, especially one for preparing a dish in cookery. So recipes are combinations of different amounts of different ingredients that, when combined in a particular way, yield a particular dish. Two different recipes for spaghetti bolognese might both be called spaghetti bolognese, but they will be different. While different recipes for the same meal might contain similar ingredients, it'll be the differences in the amount of those ingredients. It'll be differences in the amount of those ingredients that will contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions differently. As I've acknowledged, the meat industry comes in for a fair bit of criticism around its emissions, and that is principally because no matter how you grow a cow, it's going to produce methane. And methane is 86% more potent and longer living than carbon. So while it's well recorded in the literature that beef and lamb have higher greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram, and that chicken and fish do not, we should not conclude that because a dish contains beef, it would necessarily have higher amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, because it's the quantity that we choose to eat. In figure 7, which is coming to some of my research, there's only a moderate correlation between the type of meat and the greenhouse gas emissions of recipes. On a per-serve basis, beef casserole and beef steak and vegetable were the most emission intensive, while pan-fried chicken and chicken stir-fry were the least. However, when the type of meat is combined with the quantity of the meat, there is a very, very strong correlation. So we shouldn't demonise the type of meat, we need to address the amount that we're choosing to eat. Reducing food waste is another obvious and efficient strategy for reducing the environmental impact of the diet, and depending on the makeup of that food waste will represent a significant reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions of the food system. While waste has been assumed in this study to be consistent across all food groups, that may not necessarily follow and would require more work. But we know that around 20 to 30% of food in Australia is wasted. Think of the wasted resources to bring that food to the plate, as well as the methane generation if it ends up in landfill. So moderating consumption of high carbon impact foods will be especially beneficial to reducing diet-related greenhouse gas emissions. However, simply substituting high carbon intensive foods for less carbon intensive foods may give a perverse outcome, as the success will depend as the success of that substitution will depend on the amount of food required to match the energy and nutrient content to meet the needs of the body. Further, it's worth noting that even if you choose a vegetarian diet for reasons to limit your climate impact, you have to consider where and how those vegetables are grown. Electricity used to drive bores and pivot irrigation systems in Victoria will likely come from coal, and brown coal at that. The same vegetable grown in Tasmania will come from hydro, so we'll have a lower greenhouse gas emission intensity. So let's pause for a moment and recap. We must accept that everything we do will generate greenhouse gases. So perhaps the best we can hope to do is kill the planet more slowly. But there are some things we can do. My work shows that we need to reduce the overconsumption, a reduction in food waste, a reduction in serve size, of the total serve size, but also a reduction in the meat content of those meals. Meat was once a luxury, but I think we've come to expect it almost every day. Perhaps we need to get back to the way of life where a magnificent animal was reared and killed for special occasions. Much of this will be beneficial for our health too, as I've said. Now, while we need to fly less, drive our cars less, manage our population and consumption, the easiest thing we can impact immediately and every day is how we eat. Climate change will arguably become the single biggest issue to face global economies in general and in food and agricultural businesses in particular. And I've estimated that as Australians, we have a daily food print, so that's across all our meals now, of 9.4 kilos. So go back to those 13,400 balloons, it's now about 3 times that. That is actually at the low end of reported studies from other parts of the world, based on other types of studies. However, taking that figure of 9.4 kilos over the day, I've then estimated that our national footprint is responsible for around about 78 million tonnes of CO2. You can see these numbers are getting big. And that represents around about 18% of Australia's total carbon emissions. So going back to some data I referred to earlier, that's at the low end, because remember I said other studies have said it's about a third of all emissions are related to the food we eat. So my work comes in at the low end of that. So this raises an important point in my discussion. Now I'm going to follow the French tradition of cheese before dessert, and when the cheese comes, that's usually a signal for some more controversial discussion points and some radical ideas. We're going to step away from food for just a minute. Aluminium production is an industry that also comes in for a fair amount of criticism for its greenhouse gas emission footprint. Well, consider this. Aluminium produces 15.6 CO2 equivalent, kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product. Pigs, 9.8, chicken, 5.3, pulses, 3.3, and yes, beef is very high, depending on the farming system. But rather than talking about total output of greenhouse gas emissions, maybe we need to talk about the output per kilogram of utility it gives us. Secondly, whenever we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in the press and in the political sphere, we talk in terms of production. For example, the electricity sector, petrochemicals, transportation. Well, what drives that production? It's us, consumers. We drive that production, and a purist would say that businesses are there to make a profit and will best be able to do that by meeting the desires of their consumers better than anyone else. What would happen if we talked not in terms of production but in terms of consumption when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions? I think we might have a significantly different kind of discussion, one where we, the consumer, the voter, the individual is in charge, one where we might be able to see the contribution of our consumption choices to global warming. Let's start with something most of us do 3 times a day, and that's eat. Consider advertisements about driving and stopping the road toll and the impact that has on our families. The success of those campaigns is because they're very personal. They focus on the personal impact to you. Don't trust your tired self. How many people is it to be killed? How many people is okay to be killed on the road each year? They're very personal messages. Why not the same approach to talking about greenhouse gas emissions? Make it personal. It's not the energy sector that's responsible for 34% of the emissions. It's us turning on our lights, driving our cars and heating our homes. What if, like a tax return, we had to make an emissions return? Wouldn't that drive quite different behaviours? We need to talk about emissions in terms of consumption, not production. Well, the cheese course is finished, so we'll move on to dessert. If dinner is responsible for the largest kilojoule use of our food system, it also represents a significant threat to the health of our planet. It also presents the largest opportunity to stabilise it. In the MLA report that I used for the basis of the work, environmental considerations were not even a recorded driver. So this understanding opens up markets for agribusinesses and other commercial enterprises to market environmentally balanced meals in the way that nutritional meal plans, such as those marketed by Weight Watchers or Light and Easy. Consumers are familiar with the Energy Star rating on white goods, emissions ratings for new cars, and nutritional thumbnails on the front of packs. A carbon footprint may be a generational development in that kind of thinking. For businesses, once consumers have an awareness of their footprint, new enterprises may be developed to respond to the consumer demand. We could have a long discussion about the political inaction on climate change, but businesses are already making changes because they understand that reducing greenhouse gas emissions will become a simple expectation of their consumers, much like their food safety or the safety of their workers in their workplaces. At a government and policy level, understanding meal habits and their environmental impact will be important in influencing the population to eat well for themselves and the planet, and balance the large economic interests of the country which rely on farm meat to some extent. There are many community behavioural change campaigns such as anti-smoking, drink driving, seat belts and healthy eating that are first built on consumer understanding. But consumers are still largely unaware of the connection between greenhouse gas emissions and the environmental problems, and more generally of their food waste and food choices. Just as governments have played a central role in addressing the health of the nation, they will have to play a central role in redirecting our diets to a sustainable footing. The new National Healthy Eating Guidelines will come out in I think it's 2022. It'll be interesting to see if there's any mention of environmental impact in those. I often reflect on the success of the replacement of the incandescent light globes with LEDs. The reason this was successful was because it was a very small change made by many people, but no real behaviour change was required. I simply used this light bulb instead of this light bulb. I think electric cars are great, but it will require a big behaviour change for the consumer, rather than, say, hydrogen, which will be just like going to the fuel station and in 10 minutes I'm done and I'm on the road again. There won't be much of a behaviour change. So a small change in our eating habits will be more successful than trying to shift cultural contexts. Greenhouse gas emissions have become a proxy for total environmental impact of an activity, and the work I did used greenhouse gas emissions as the measure. However, greenhouse gas emissions are not a full indicator of environmental damage, and other indicators could show even different or contradictory results. Focusing on greenhouse gas emissions as the measure of relative environmental consequences could be a gross oversimplification. It could be argued in Australia, in our agricultural context, where water is often the limiting resource and a direct cost of production through irrigation licences, that water intensity of meals may be a better measure. However, water intensity itself is also subject to much conjecture. For example, it's estimated in New South Wales that the amount of water used in beef cattle production ranges from 3.3 litres to 220 litres of water per kilogram of live weight at the farm gate. It all depends on the system under which it's farmed. I have to acknowledge that my work has a number of limitations. There are a number of inconsistencies in methodologies for measuring greenhouse gas emissions in the food systems, and different authors draw different boundaries in their studies. So not all things are comparable. My study itself ignored the impact of cooking at home, for example. The vegetable data, the vegetable data that I used is based on Australian data. However, the environmental impact of, and specifically the greenhouse gas emissions of those vegetables will vary significantly depending on where and how they're grown. So, for coffee and a petit foie before we all go home for dinner. The future will rest on us as consumers, as individuals around our dinner tables, in our cars, often referred to as dashboard dining, at the office, the playground, lunchtime, picnics, eating with our families. We must eat within our means economically and nutritionally, but also now ecologically. Much guidance is provided to consumers on the nutritional value of food, yet very little advice is there to help consumers make choices on sustainability. To me, it appears that consumers who have essentially lost touch with the way our food comes to them are quite unaware of the food system and the significant cost it's having on the environment. And while consumers might well understand that burning fossil fuels makes a contribution to climate change, there's little connection between that climate change and the fossil fuel use used in our food system. I think that as we begin this conversation around our food print, it will be critical not to repeat the mistakes of the nutrition movement. This work has not been about demonising one ingredient or one industry over another. To do so would repeat the demonisation of fat that largely led to the replacement of fat by carbohydrate. And wow, what a wonderful success that had been. From the earliest times of our white settlement, our diet and food choices have been regarded as unsuitable for the land and climate. It's now time to consider the impact of our individual food choices on our shared carbon budget. We don't share a nutrition budget, but we do share the carbon budget. Notwithstanding all the data and discussions on this subject, the best encapsulation of how to tackle these problems are not words of mine, but they're words of an author who I've read a great deal of, and that is Michael Pollan. Eat food, mostly plants, not too much. So I encourage you to choose your next dinner as if the world depended on it, because it absolutely does. Thank you very much.